This is Dan Clark Audio's latest headphone. It's called the Dan Clark Audio E3, and it's being announced right around the time you're watching this. Priced at $1,999.99, the Dan Clark Audio E3 might be the best value Dan Clark Audio headphone released to date. And because I think Dan Clark Audio has been releasing some of the best performance for the price headphones for many years, saying that about the E3 is quite a statement. Now, I know the E3 at first blush might look more like an open back headphone, which is what I also thought it was when I first saw the photos of it. But the E3, to be clear, is a closed back headphone. We'll get back to the E3's appearance and styling in just a bit. Now, because Dan Clark has visited Head-Fi HQs so many times, I decided to finally make the trip from Detroit to San Diego to visit their headquarters recently. And I was able to sit down with Dan to discuss the new E3, and so I'm going to let Dan Clark himself give you a little background on the E3.
So this is E3. This is our new mid-range closed-back headphone. It's a all-new planar magnetic driver. I believe this is actually our 5th generation, maybe our 6th generation of driver design now. And we've tried to incorporate all the things we've learned about in terms of audio performance and production and manufacturing and reliability into this driver. So a ton of engineering's gone into this. In fact, this may have been one of our longer R&D projects. It took quite a while to get through the pipeline because of the number of changes we made. And those changes range from new diaphragm material and new way of applying our v-planar knurling technology to a novel implementation of our acoustic metamaterial tuning system, or AMTS. And the result is a headphone that's I think it's a very elegant headphone. It's a closed back design, but it has the features that people have been really liking from Stealth and Expanse, like the self-adjusting strap, as well as the collapsing gimbals for portability. And it also has our AMTS acoustic metamaterial technology, but in this instance, it's been deployed in a new way that gave us some additional performance attributes that we were able to realize that I think really help the headphone's performance for a broader audience. For example, the way AMTS is deployed in this makes the headphone a little less sensitive to seal for people who wear glasses or may have thicker hair, so that you won't experience, for instance, the bass roll-off, or you'll experience less bass roll-off than you typically do when the seal in a headphone is broken.
Since Dan's talking about AMTS, which again stands for Acoustic Metamaterial Tuning System, I wanted to say a little bit more about it. I think the E3 is the 4th DCA headphone. Let's see, there was the Stealth, then the Expanse, then the Carina, and now the E3. So it's the 4th Dan Clark Audio headphone to use AMTS. Now, in case you're not familiar with what AMTS is, it's a single, very complex piece into and onto which Dan Clark Audio integrates waveguides, diffusion control, quarter wave, and Helmholtz resonators, all into one compact structure able to control resonances and shape frequency response. Since developing AMTS, they've learned even more about what they can do with it, and so they've also learned some new AMTS tricks. Now, throughout our conversation, I really pushed Dan to the limits of what he was willing to talk about in great detail on video. I was pushing to discuss details about their engineering and processes that Dan and I often have comprehensive talks about in private, so we ended up having to edit out a lot of our discussion. Anyway, this is maybe why, in parts of our talk here, you'll see Dan understandably seems a little tentative about going too much into detail on video, like in this next clip. But here he does explain some of the new AMTS features in the E3.
Well, I will simply say that when we designed the AMTS technology and we wrote our patent for it, we talk a little bit about different modalities of deployment. And we've now done 3 very different ways of using the product, the AMTS technology, with Stealth and Expanse deployed in one way, Carina in yet another, and this deployed in yet another. And so the AMTS continues to really show just how versatile it is. It's such a complicated piece of technology that sometimes it's hard to keep your head wrapped around it, because it's actually solving multiple problems. It's a waveguide, it's a diffusion surface, it's a filter that allows us to shape the outbound frequency response, and it's a filter that allows us to absorb standing waves. So it's got all these functions that are built into it, and then there's the notion of how it's coupled to the driver. And in this instance, what we did is we changed the way it's coupled to the driver. And so it's kind of a hybrid model that falls in between Carina and Stealth and Expanse in terms of how it was actually deployed.
And how AMTS is coupled to the driver in the E3 is in fact novel and frankly ingenious, but we understandably could not show it or the explanation behind it on video, though I really wish we could. Anyway, this was all to accomplish tuning goals that Dan Clark had for the E3. Dan talks a little bit more about this, including some interesting discussion of frequency responses and the Harman target with respect to the E3 and other Dan Clark audio headphones.
Yes, the way we've designed it is that there's, well, first I'll talk about why we did that.
Okay, sure.
And then a little bit about how,
Okay.
within the limits of not disclosing too much about the technology.
Fair
But the why was that we've made, since Noir, most of our headphones have tried to stick fairly close to the Harman curve through a big chunk of the spectrum. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. First, the Harman curve was a reasonable methodological way to say, we know from science and decades of research what a good speaker sounds like in a well-tuned room. And the experiment to generate the Harman curve was to allow users to use equalization to replicate that experience through headphones. Now, the limitations to that are, it's a subjective interpretation of how I'm experiencing in a room, and it's also done with, it's not with parametric EQ that somebody like me would use. It was kind of with old school EQ that more, lay people would use. And that means that it's kind of an approximation and an approximation of an experience of a speaker in a room, which is not to say that it's correlating to I experience this live in, if I were listening to a cello outside with no room at all,
Sure.
It would sound like this. And so what I did is I took a different approach this time, and I said, as much as I love the Harman curve's response, and I really love Stealth and Expanse, I went and again go do one of the things I like doing, which is going into music stores and play some guitars, bang on some drums, blat into a few horns insofar as I can, not trying to play music per se, but just to keep myself reminded of what live, unamplified acoustic sounds like. And as I did that, I felt like there were a couple of areas where the Harman curve didn't, for me, sound quite the same as what I was experiencing live. Now, mind you, these aren't huge variations. And, I think the thing that a lot of people miss when they talk about the Harman curve is people treat it like it's some kind of absolute. And of course, it's not.
Yeah, even Sean says it's not. Yeah.
Yeah, the creator of the Harman curve says it's not.
Right.
It's not the thing you should hit. It's a it's like the Pirates Code. It's it's kind of like you want it to be a bit like this, matey.
Right.
And so as I was listening, I felt like a little bit of additional emphasis on the upper registers and a little bit of additional emphasis in the lower mid-range in particular would give a warmer yet more vibrant tone that was a little closer to maybe some of what I was experiencing in acoustic music or acoustic instruments. And so that's what I did. And I set out to kind of replicate that experience and, and kind of in a sense improvising on the theme. And I feel like the result is really good. It's just a wonderfully organic and natural sounding headphone, and it just plays beautifully with everything from acoustic guitar to the tranciest trance,
Tranciest trance. Yeah, no, I'm with you. So actually what you're talking about with respect to Harman target is interesting because, this is a conversation I've had actually very recently. I've had it several times actually. About how I would tune a headphone if I was making one. I'm not, by the way, but let's just say hypothetically I'm making the Jude Audio ABC123. I've talked about, one of the places I'd probably certainly consider starting is with the Harman target and then tuning to taste. I think there's, I think everybody knows some of your headphones have tracked pretty closely with Harman. And now I feel like you're also tuning to taste. And actually, if you look at there was a Constantine Davey over at USound did a study for them, but it was the Harman in-ear target, but it's still a relevant discussion in this context. he plotted a shaded area over the target, the average, that is the 90% confidence interval based on Harman's own data from that research.
Yeah, and it was huge. It was
Huge.
like +6 and minus
Yeah,
3 dB in the
well,
base or something. It was like
at 100 dB, it was like, 100 dB, 100 hertz, it might have been like 10 dB
yeah, it was
in the
huge.
shaded area. So if you were to say, for example, tune EQ to the bottom line that defined the bottom part of the shaded area, right? And that's headphone 1. And then you EQ or tune another headphone, otherwise the same, but to the top part of the shade line. These would be vastly different sounding headphones,
Yes.
and they would still be within the 90% confidence interval of the Harman.
Yes.
That was the in-ear target. But yeah, but I think we get the point here. And I think, so you're saying that's still in the range. You just chose to tune it to target within that range, maybe within, not specifically within 90% confidence interval, but it's in that. That's kind of the vein in which we're discussing this, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
These are, in a sense, you can call it a variation on a theme. And, I've been in the business long enough to know that no matter what I do, some people are going to think this is an improvement over stealth and expanse, and other people are going to think stealth and expanse are hands down better.
Right.
Just like when we made the Mad Dog and then brought out the Alpha Dog, there were some people who was like, I just like my Alpha Dog so much more than this. And, it's like there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
If based on your music and your listening preferences and what you're listening for, something does a better job for you, then you go with that. That said, I think that what this does is this delivers a huge level of technical performance at a price point that's going to be really much more accessible to people. And I think that this really does deliver a full top-of-the-line sound experience and comfort experience, but it's half the price.
Now, AMTS, which I believe is patent pending, and the unique coupling of AMTS in the E3's design is not the only novel thing Dan Clark Audio employed with the E3. Dan Clark Audio aficionados and those who've watched our videos over the years may remember mention of one of their other inventions, one that is patented, that they designed back when the company was called Mr. Speakers, called VPlaner Technology. What VPlaner involves is a type of knurling on the surface of the diaphragm. That is, they deeply crease it. It allows more of the driver surface to move, increasing its radiating area. Among other benefits, DCA says VPlaner also reduces standing wave modalities on the driver diaphragm, can push more air at lower frequencies, deliver better dynamics and high-end frequency response, and measurably lowers distortion. But I noticed something different about the E3's VPlaner implementation. I wasn't sure if it was something Dan would talk about on video, so I asked him about it.
One of the things that we did, we worked also very, very hard on the knurling technology, our V-planar knurling. We went through hundreds of experiments with different approaches to implementing the knurl. Patterns, depth of the pattern, pressure that the pattern was applied at. And
okay. V-planar goes back to, which was the first headphone to use that?
We developed that with Alpha Prime. That was the difference between the Alpha Dog and Alpha Prime.
Okay, all right. So let's explain the knurling just really quickly. I think it's important to revisit it because it's not a minor part of what's happening here or with any of your newest drivers.
Yep.
So there's knurling on the driver. Can we explain it? We'll try to maybe cut some B-roll into it, show people what we're talking about in terms of just the basic concept.
Sure. The idea with knurling, and this is something we've got a patent on actually, is that what we're doing is we're forming the driver to a pattern that allows us to maintain better control of the diaphragm as it's moving. In theory, a planar diaphragm will move like this, where it's got a boundary condition that holds the edges clamped, and then there's coils on the surface, and the diaphragm goes like this, up and down and up and down. And what happens is you get modalities at certain frequencies where the diaphragm may start to do this a little bit. And that won't necessarily show up as distortion. It may simply show up as an excess or a lack of amplitude at a certain frequency. And as you knurl the driver, that stabilizes the diaphragm in some ways, and it can destabilize it in others. So the trick with it is that you have to kind of find the optimization point where you get the best frequency response and the lowest distortion attributes. And that's the art and science of it. And this is affected by the tension that your diaphragm's manufactured at and the materials that you're using. And for this driver, we went and selected some different materials for reasons I won't get into,
Sure.
but it required us to revisit the knurl And that ended up being a real science fair.
The knurling seems... Okay, so first of all, it's very different than the first v-planar implementation.
Yes.
Very different.
Yes.
Because that one was almost more like uniform pleating.
That's right. That was a regular grid, basically.
Yeah. And then this one is not anything like that. It's much more intricate design. Like this very specific intricate design based on where in the driver it is.
And it's a much deeper knurl.
That's what
I was
okay. I wasn't sure if I could be able to mention that.
Yeah.
So the knurling...
That's actually one of the parts of the patent is actually discussing that the effect of the knurl has to be beyond a certain depth relative to the materials in use.
Okay.
Form.
But the thing I wanted to say, and if I can say it, but I think you just gave it away, so I can, is that it is much more prominent, at least visually.
Yes.
Like I can see the knurling much more clearly on this driver than any previous driver.
Yes.
So that can't, because I've seen the other drivers, obviously. Okay. So it is, I'm not seeing things.
Yeah, no, and I mean that's it to the extent that people read a patent, that's covered in the patent. So it's that's public already.
Okay. Yeah, but it does look different in this one.
But it looks noticeably different. Yeah, we really pushed the technology, and that was part of sometimes we've done experiments here where we're doing it and I'm working on something and I'm like, that doesn't seem to have done it. I'll do a little more.
Right.
And there have been times when we're like, I can't believe I'm able to keep pushing this lever and things haven't exploded. That happened a lot during the development of Vocha as we were working on tensioning the diaphragm. It's like we did some levels of tension where I was like, I can't believe this isn't just exploding with that much weight on it. How much weight can 2.4 microns hold? But it actually can hold way more than you think. And so sometimes your inherent assumptions that you make about what a material can or can't do are just limited by your imagination rather than by the material. And the knurling was one of those instances where, we thought we'd already been pushing it. And then we felt like in this instance with this material, it wasn't doing as much of what we wanted. And we just started dialing it up. And it really, it took a long time and a lot of work to make that work out.
Now I want to revisit the E3's styling very briefly because, again, it looks a lot like an open-back headphone, and that's very deliberate. Here's Dan explaining the E3's aesthetics.
Yeah, one of the things that you notice when you put it on is even for us, I think we're probably, we have a reputation for making closed headphones that don't sound closed. And I think this one really is that in some ways on steroids and stilts. It really just has no sense of being closed to it. And so as we were going through the design decisions to do the aesthetic design of it, one of the things that was important to us was to figure out how to convey a sense of openness. And so what we did was we actually put a pattern in that resembles a bit of a grill, so that, and that pattern is underneath a piece of Gorilla Glass. So it looks open like there's a mesh, but in fact, it's a solid Gorilla Glass surface. And we used Gorilla Glass V3, which is just super tough stuff. We wanted to make sure that even though there's glass in it, that this was a really reliable, sturdy product. And so in our drop testing, we actually have a balcony here that we use with a 14-foot drop onto porcelain. And when we were drop testing it, the metal gave way before the glass.
Oh, that's yeah. So there's effectively it's a mesh, right? That's that gives us.
No, it's actually a printed. It's actually printed on the inside of the glass.
Oh, you're kidding?
Yeah, but it has a real three-dimensional textured look to it.
It really does.
We played a few tricks in how the pattern was generated.
So again, the E3 looks like an open back headphone because it really does sound a lot like one. In fact, the E3 is, to my ears, the widest imaging of the closed back Dan Clark audio headphones to date. So maybe one of the widest imaging closed back headphones, period. Anyway, at this point then, let's talk about how the E3 sounds. Like all their current headphones, the E3 from Dan Clark Audio has outstanding technical chops. You know when you hear something and it just sounds well engineered? That's essentially all of Dan Clark Audio's current flagship headphones, and I'd say the E3 is definitely one of them. One of the Dan Clark Audio flagships, even though it's half the price of their actual flagships. The Dan Clark Audio Stealth has been one of my absolute favorite closed-back headphones since its release, and the E3 does remind me of the Stealth, but with some very key differences. Compared to the Stealth, the E3 has a livelier sound. Its mid-range is more sculpted and incisive. I think this is in line with what Dan was looking for when he said he wanted something more live-sounding. And I'd say the E3 is airier up top than even the Stealth, but to my ears, thankfully, it has not been bright, which I appreciate as I tend to shy away from bright headphones. The E3 also images wider than the Stealth. Now, since in general I tend to favor smoother sounding headphones, and because I do not prioritize soundstage width as much as some of you might, gun to head, I'd say overall I'd still take the Stealth. But please don't put that gun in my head because the E3 is different enough from the Stealth, and I sometimes do favor the E3's livelier mids and treble depending on my mood, that having both around still makes perfect sense. The Stealth's smoother top end does give it an overall fuller, richer tone to my ears, which I do love. But I do have a feeling there are a good number of you who'd take the E3 overall, even over the twice as expensive Stealth. Now, a lot of what I said about the Stealth comparison also applies to the E3 versus Expanse comparison. I mean, I have referred to the Expanse as a sort of open-back Stealth before. Again, the E3 has an overall livelier sound versus the Expanse, but in terms of openness, the actually open-back Expanse still beats out the very open-sounding for a closed-back E3. Again, as in the comparison to the Stealth, the E3 seems to have a more sculpted mid-range than the Expanse. Simply put, overall, the E3 comes closer to the Expanse and the Stealth than I'd expect it to for its price. In other words, the E3 is Dan Clark Audio's most cost-effective flagship by a country mile. Now, one of my longtime favorite headphones, and a common reference headphone for so many in this community, is the Sennheiser HD800S. I still love listening to the HD800S. Now, compared to the Dan Clark Audio E3, though, the HD800S, which for a dynamic headphone is still a technical marvel in my opinion, it's simply not as refined as the E3 overall. The E3 also has greater resolving ability, and it resolves more while being less bright. The E3's is a highly engineered sound signature, and it sounds next generation in comparison. So if you're an HD800S lover, so you like a livelier sound signature, but you want more slam, audition the E3. I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but the E3 does definitely have slam when called upon. Its bass extension is deep, and I like the lift it was given down low. In other words, the Dan Clark Audio E3 is lively sounding from bottom to top. Anyway, before I go and before I get to measurements, I wanted to thank Dan Clark Audio for welcoming me to their headquarters in San Diego. I had an amazing time. Now, one of my favorite things about visiting manufacturers is getting to see and experience things that are behind closed doors for understandable reasons. The bummer is that I can't share a lot of it, perhaps even most of it, on posts or on video. Now, at Dan Clark Audio's headquarters, there was a lot of this. The things they do, the research and development, the way they internally design and build, a lot of the very tools, fixtures, and systems they use to build and test their headphones, it was an eye-opening visit. I saw many things I hadn't seen before. Now, here are a couple of examples of cool things I can share. This is one of their driver burn-in setups. How cool is that? I was also thrilled to see them using their Clipple driver matching system adapted to test the E3's ear pads. The system tests the ear pads, one of the greatest potential sources of variation with headphones, and it results in well-matched ear pads, and also results in a good number of rejected ear pads due to their strict tolerances. Okay, I know a lot of you want to see the measurements, so here they are. This is the Dan Clark Audio E3's frequency response. Here's the E3's frequency response compared to the Stealth, unnormalized using 80 dB SPL of white noise. Here's the E3's frequency response compared to the Stealth again, but this time making a slight adjustment, normalized at 1.5 kHz. I find this, to my ears, is a more perceptually relevant comparison of the frequency response of these two headphones. Here's the E3's frequency response compared to the Expanse, unnormalized using 80 dB SPL of white noise. Here's the E3's frequency response compared to the Expanse, but this time normalized at 100 Hz for what I think is a more perceptually relevant comparison between these two headphones' frequency responses. Since I mentioned the Sennheiser HD800S, here's the Dan Clark Audio E3's frequency response compared to the Sennheiser HD800S. This is unnormalized, again using 80 dB SPL of white noise, and I found this to be a perceptually relevant comparison unnormalized. And finally, this is a plot of the E3's THD, or total harmonic distortion. As I've come to expect from Dan Clark Audio, this is exemplary. Across the entire measurement, THD is below 0.1%. Most of it is actually closer to 0.05% or lower. That's just superb. Okay, that's it for this one. Please remember to like and subscribe. It does help, and we will be increasing our video output, so make sure not to miss anything we do. I want to once again say thanks to Dan Clark and Andy Regan and the whole team at Dan Clark Audio. I had a great time, and their new E3 is an exceptional headphone. Thanks for watching, and see you next time on Headfi TV, hopefully in person at CanJam and on the forums at headfi.org.